Let's dig in, everybody. So the 100 and 100 project started in spring of this year with the survey and 4 focus groups that were held in Northwest Minnesota. And this part of our project was led by Kate Stowers, who's pictured there. And this portion of our research was focused on identifying barriers to leadership, needed support in rural areas, and what networks rural women were a part of formally and informally. By that, we mean what types of groups women were a part of that were organized in a more official capacity, meaning a group with a name or with intentional facilitators, as opposed to more informal gatherings, such as a coffee group, which is spontaneous or naturally occurring. And we had 169 respondents to our online survey and 41 participants over 4 virtual focus groups. The largest takeaways from our pilot phase was the need for time savers, such as virtual events, offering childcare, and flexible responsibilities, the need to address community mindsets so that women leaders feel supported, and the need for networks and groups to encourage and support practicing leadership. If you're interested in learning more about our pilot project, our June 2021 webinar was led by Kate and really dug into it a lot more. So moving on to the next slide, to build off of our pilot project, we expanded our research efforts statewide and planned 6 meetings in each RSDP region, as well as 7 in metro areas. Our main research question was wanting to focus on accountable steps we as an organization could do to serve rural women, to move forward, hearing everything that was not working currently, and instead practice what is called asset-based community development. And this practice highlights and uplifts the power and strengths communities already have. So in this case, recognizing what rural communities already have and offer rural women and building upon that, not necessarily reinventing the wheel. And as such, in our advertising, we had our group of interns scour the internet for email address, event forms, and literally any group or connection we could find. We emailed them, invited them to this meeting. And we recognized that there are already ways we share information in rural areas, and we wanted to use those connections. So moving on, before we get into our focus group data, I want to highlight a few takeaways from our survey. And a really important highlight is that the majority of women who engaged with our survey and focus groups had leadership roles currently or previously in their lives. I think that is important to keep in mind as we think about the voices missing from these conversations. We heard from a lot of individuals that they don't think of themselves as leaders despite doing leadership type actions. So we think this suggests to us that we may want to be more mindful in the future about how we talk about leadership and how we brand these gatherings. We may also want to target specifically individuals who have not been able to have leadership opportunities at all, and to hear what needs may be unique to them. So on the next slide, okay, yeah. A unique aspect of our survey were several belief questions where individuals could say whether they strongly agreed, slightly agreed, were neutral, slightly disagreed, or strongly disagreed about a statement. And as we can see here, the individuals who participated in our survey overwhelmingly felt that women were as skilled as men. And on the next slide, we see the same thing here, that women are tough enough for leadership. And something unique happened, however, when we asked about how women perceived other women's confidence and self-image. You can see that the belief of how women see themselves dramatically falls. And on the next slide, we can see again that the women responded alike when thinking about confidence and risk taking. So lastly, I just want to think about these seemingly contradictory beliefs and make sense when we see this result that overwhelmingly the women who took this survey feel that women are not held to the same standards as men. And how can we feel successful, or can they feel successful if their expectations keep moving or are much further away from their male peers? How can women be successful. And that was the focus of our focus groups, which I'll hand it over to Jasmine and Delaney to take us through.
Yeah, so going into our focus groups, which was the large portion of what individuals engaged with us over the summer in live sessions, we first want to share and kind of be able to be very open about who was here with us. With it naturally being a point in time during the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the changing responsibilities, we had more people sign up who then did actually come. And we think that's a really salient point of recognizing the many different ways that women are pulled with responsibilities, whether that is work, whether that is childcare. I can't count how many times a few moments before a focus group meeting or even in the time leading up to it that women would email us saying, I'm so sorry, but my childcare fell through, or I'm home with a sick child, or I can no longer make this. Some responsibilities at work are too demanding of me and I won't be able to join us for an afternoon, because there is an absolute aspect of understanding who has the time to come spend speaking with us. And so that's something that we really want to recognize and thank those who did come and spend their energy with us. There wasn't a statistically significant difference in drop off in terms of these different demographic areas. We do want to recognize the most recent data we have about racial identity in rural Minnesota is that around over 90% of that population is white, non-Hispanic, and we pretty much match that in terms of our outreach. Same thing with the age differences. A larger percentage of rural Minnesota are older, around age 50 or so. And so we feel that we were pretty close to the mark in regards to the actual individuals who live there. We also want to recognize today when we're talking about regions, we're using the RDSP regions that Linda and Andy work with. And so if you have interest in want to know specifically what counties are in these regions, you can visit the website Emma has already shared earlier, and she probably will be able to drop it again now that I'm asking her on the spot. And we also want to recognize who was here in terms of amount. And so you can see here that we had a pretty great reach with the dot being represented the size of individuals we had from each county. We had participants from 77 counties out of Minnesota's 87. So we were pretty confident about our overall statewide outreach as opposed to our pilot, which was focused just in the northwest corner. We also want to recognize that we had participants from Minnesota's Native Nations with us, and we really just want to recognize and honor that as the spaces that they inhabit overlap with different counties. And so we really thank them for coming and spending and sharing their time with us as well. So overall, before we jump into the really nitty-gritty data, we want to say that the largest takeaways from our focus groups was the desire for community and asks from our peers, being able to be in spaces where we can learn from each other, where we can talk authentically and almost informally in ways to really learn about strategies and ways to engage with leadership. Something important and that we heard really positive feedback about was at the beginning of our focus groups, sharing and specifying that leadership is not just a formal role. It is not just a formal title. And so encouraging women when we were talking through our questions that we'll get into in just a moment to really think about leadership in all dimensions of their lives, not just their professional lives. I think overall, what can kind of encompass the main asks we got is this quote from a participant, which reads, "It's nice to have that structured space with a focus on leadership, but it's more about connecting as women. Just having an open space to have conversation and dialogue that's really authentic and genuine and can help people not feel so isolated." And that is a large portion of what we heard today. So to give you an idea of the questions we asked at our focus groups, we broke them apart into initially coming into small breakout rooms facilitated by a 100-woman staff member. These first 3 questions we have at the top, and then these ones we have lower on the slide, we did a mixture of Google Jamboards, which Jasmine will share more about with us later, and then discussing aloud individuals' responses to these prompts. So our first question in our small breakout rooms was asking, when have you felt like a leader? Which I'm going to ask Andy to read one of the participants' quotes.
I think I feel like a leader when I'm helping others, lifting other team members up, not only leading the meetings, the activities that we're doing, but also just being part of the community.
And I think this quote really highlights that what we mentioned earlier, that individuals didn't really like the idea of leadership, or never really said, I felt like a leader as soon as I got my director role or my position and my official title. Individuals over and over and over again acknowledged that being a leader was doing actionable things. It was being with their peers. It was help with activities and tasks. It wasn't just simply being in a role or being in a space. It was continuously the part of them engaging with their peers. We have another quote from our participant that Andy's going to read.
Oh, I would be happy to. When I was at home taking care of our kids for 8 years, I was still a leader and involved in lots of stuff. But even if I wasn't, I was still a leader, no doubt.
And this was something that came up as well. Once we had kind of redefined our idea of leadership and encouraged women to think not, again, just about roles, women identified that once they had children, or if that was a part of their life, that affected how they viewed themselves, because they didn't see themselves as much engaging in a very professional public sphere. But there was still this aspect of taking care of children, being a parent, and just engaging with your community in perhaps, again, more informal, less professional ways, but still in community groups, volunteering with children or volunteering in organizations really was a prevalent way that women engaged in and felt like leaders. So our next question we had in our breakout rooms was asking women specifically, what kind of leadership skills would you be interested in developing? To which I'm going to ask Emma to read our first quote.
A lot of the challenges I've had in my leadership roles have been setting personal boundaries, burnout, not overcommitting, and engaging other people in meaningful ways in the work.
And this was just something that continued to show up again and again. We did have specific asks for types of skills, but we also just had these kind of more soft skills. That's not necessarily something taught from, a degree program or a certification program. It's this interpersonal engagement with each other of how to protect our time and our energy. As we recognized earlier, women are pulled in a lot of different ways, whether it's professionally, whether it's personally, if they choose to become a parent, what that looks like. And it was having a hard time navigating those different spheres in their lives that continue to show up again and again in these conversations. I'm going to ask Emma to read our next quote as well.
I still get very anxious and find myself feeling silenced when I'm encountering like an old boys club. I think that dynamic is still there and we pretend it's gotten better. And it probably has in some places, but I don't know if it has in rural spaces as much.
And this request we saw a lot, this idea and the issue of understanding how to navigate hierarchies, that the institutions that some women found themselves participating in, they didn't quite know how to navigate processes that came before them that are really these strong institutional old ways of doing work and engaging with other professionals. And so this was an ask and kind of an idea of both confidence and understanding how to see and engage in opportunities when you just weren't quite there. You weren't quite seen as someone who should do this, or if there wasn't necessarily a space already made for you to engage with it. Our other question we had in our small breakout rooms was asking, if there's something that could help other women like you develop leadership skills, what would it be? And I'm going to ask Emma to read this quote as well. Or sorry, Andy. Nope, sorry, Archie. Apologies.
No problem. We are much more frequently with people whose ideas diverge from our own, from your own. In an urban setting, you can pretty well stay in your bubble. But in a rural setting, we just find ourselves constantly in situations where we are not in agreement on some important political issues and cultural issues.
And this was a really common idea of understanding how to facilitate conversations and hold communication spaces, especially when it felt really, really difficult. With everything that's going on in the world with COVID and politics and a lot of spaces, these really come to a head in rural spaces because there is this smaller community. You know people all around you, and you're more likely to run into them and again and again. And it was this ask about being able to have the skills to facilitate these conversations and hold space and continue conversating even when it gets really difficult. It was just something that women felt that they, and specifically their roles of sometimes having to be just that facilitator and to be able to hold space for others, that they wanted more support on how to do it well and how to respect and uphold other people's boundaries. I'm going to ask RG to read the next quote as well.
I'm really just on the very beginning pieces of my career, and what's sticking with me, other than some of the skill stuff that I'm gaining, is just having the access to women who are maybe even doing things that I have literally no interest in, but they're willing to talk to me and sort of be that door opener.
And this idea of mentorship was really powerful, especially with some of our younger participants, of knowing and learning how to navigate these structures and navigate power and be able to enter power roles with a kind of power component. There was a specific ask about knowing how to potentially gain leadership skills to go onto those higher level leadership spaces, because it's not necessarily easy to see how you become a county commissioner, and learning where to potentially start with smaller leadership roles. It was also something mirrored with some of our older participants of, being at a place in their career or considering retirement or being retired, that they didn't know necessarily how to share their knowledge, how to share their skills, and be able to help give back and invite people into these spaces. So we're going to next transition, as we did during our focus group meetings, to our Jamboards, which I'm going to let Jasmine introduce how those worked.
Hello. So we, after our small breakout groups, we came back and we all did a Jamboard. So what happened was Delaney Emma threw a link in the chat to Jamboard, which is an online board where people can post anonymously with sticky notes. And we just kind of sat there, played some music, let everyone do that for about 5 minutes. So we had about 4 questions, or we did have 4 questions, sorry, in the Jamboard. And our first question was, where would you like to see more women leaders? And then we look at the data. So within this question, we had 6 categories that we saw women kept bringing up. As you can see, these are the categories, and the top 2 categories we found was government and private business. Within these categories, we had subcategories, and you can see that local government was actually the most popular, that women would like to see more women in leadership positions.
I'm going to invite Molly to read this quote aloud for us.
One resource would be the opportunity to see other leadership roles, or to see a lattice or ladder to different leadership roles. What are the small steps it takes to get there?
And so this was a question that we discussed out loud of how can we enable women to take on more leadership roles in the spaces identified via those Jamboard prompts. And so this really allowed the women in our focus groups to talk about those prompts and really kind of dissect them further without necessarily identifying themselves as who gave those answers. And so again, this touches on what we mentioned earlier about understanding how to start small, especially recognizing what professional roles people may already have and what responsibilities women just have in general. Being able to start small and build those leadership skills, build those small steps of how to start getting more involved and getting experience with these things before, again, traversing onto higher and more demanding leadership spaces. I'm going to invite Molly to read another participant quote.
You need to be as strong in what your values and your positions are. Building on that confidence base, I think, is something every woman can use.
And this was felt very strongly of not necessarily feeling that they had the support, especially once they were in a leadership role, if they were the only woman on their board or on a leadership kind of hierarchy and talking and trying to make something more equitable or just bring up ideas, if they weren't getting support from other peers around them, or feeling that they just weren't hearing back from people unless it was really negative. And it was just this idea of both having to help provide confidence intrinsically and also in calling and encouraging peers and wanting to hear from peers if they're doing something well or giving constructive feedback. Our next Jamboard prompt, Jasmine.
Yeah, so our second question was, how do you find out about leadership opportunities? And we see that a lot of women say that they find out about leadership opportunities through professional connections and informal connections. So through this, we see that a lot of women find out about these opportunities through other people. And then I also wanted to highlight this category that said other. So this category was responses that didn't necessarily fit into any of these other categories. So these responses can include the library, showing support for local organizations, the newspaper, and public radio.
I'm going to invite Teresa to read our quote.
Yes, the formal structured women leadership groups, they're out there. They're amazing. Nothing wrong with those, but you're still going to get connected to people just in that group. I think the way to do it is to have every one of us willing to introduce women to other women.
And so as you can see from our Jamboard prompts and then this quote, it was this idea that, you know, listservs and kind of these informal like distance connection things are great to talk to people, but the way people are finding out leadership is through each other. It's through you personally saying, hey, I thought of you with this, or have you seen this posting, or, you know, maybe we should join this together. It's that personal aspect, that personal ask and invite. And I think there's statistics elsewhere about how many times you have to ask somebody, and specifically a woman, to run before she will for an elected role. I think that's reflected here in this data, that we can be hesitant unless there is somebody asking us again and again, and it's us personally inviting and welcoming someone into our spaces. I'm going to invite Teresa to read our next quote as well.
I think sometimes teaming up can be really helpful. I mean, co-chairing. It's not always possible in the elected positions, but in the more casual community leadership positions, a pair of partnerships or a team approach can be really comforting and helpful for women.
And this was something we saw in some of our later questions, as we'll get into, this feeling of isolation once you've made it into a leadership role, and not necessarily feeling that you had other people you could talk to, that you could get feedback on. And so it came up quite a few times of, I wish we could go together. I wish I could do this with a buddy. I wish I could be connected to somebody who really would understand these things that I'm going through. Our next Jamboard prompt.
Our third question was, what new normals have we formed during COVID that we need to carry forward? And I just wanted to say that 100 Rural Women understands that there are negative impacts of COVID, and we do not want to belittle anyone's experience of loss, death, or illness, but we wanted to focus on some of the positive impacts of COVID-19. So these were some of the responses, or these are the categories that these responses went to. And as we can see virtual work and flexibility be the top, and then there's also more time. And I wanted to explain that a little bit more, just saying that this category was more time with your family, more time with friends, more time outside, more time taking care of yourself, just more time in general that COVID-19 has brought to you. And then I just wanted to display some of the responses that were unique, such as online access to services and pajama pants, because I think we can all relate to wanting to wear pajama pants 24/7.
And I'm going to invite Emma to read our next quote.
I think the pandemic has proven that we don't need a typical 9-to-5 day. I feel like you get the most out of your employees when they have that flexibility, and the pandemic has showed me and management and leadership that people can still function at really high levels if they're not sitting in an office.
And this was really, people were talking about this in a very excited way, of the flexibility that the pandemic offered us to think about work in a really different way. And for rural women specifically, as we'll acknowledge on the next slide, the time aspect of not having to drive super far distances and super long times to attend a short meeting, to then sleep overnight there before driving home because it wasn't feasible to participate in a single day. And recognizing from a workspace that, of course, this is only going to work for individuals who have strong enough broadband to engage virtually, but to still have that flexibility and that ability to share more of their lives when people are engaging in the background and being seen as more of a whole person. I'll invite Emma to read our next quote as well.
It's just so nice to be able to get everybody get together, and we don't have a half an hour to 45-minute drive. I have a 1-year-old, so I appreciate Zoom as someone with a young child and on a board with so many rural members.
And this was just really prevalent when we were talking about how to make leadership more accessible, more doable for women, recognizing the barriers that childcare really could help reduce. Some individuals shared, we know that we need to provide childcare, we need to provide time savers when we're holding meetings, but I don't know how to do that. I would love to be able to get guidelines or be connected to individuals who can say a childcare provider needs to have this and this, or we need to have this type of thing in a space if we're going to offer it, if in a live event. And so this was just something that showed up again and again, that being able to have children at home and be able to participate in meetings with them, or just be able to take care of things and, not have to find a sitter when you're gone overnight, was really making a difference in how rural women were able to engage in leadership.
And our final Jamboard question was, where do you get support to overcome challenges in your life? We can see that there were 7 categories that these responses fit into. And similar to some of the other questions, we have informal connections and professional connections being at the top. So a lot of women receive support through other people. And then I just wanted to highlight, well, as 100 Rural Women, we wanted to highlight the mental health responses. We want to stress that this was completely anonymous, so we don't know who said this, but we really were happy that these women were able to be vulnerable and were courageous to discuss how they overcome challenges with mental health resources such as therapy and anxiety and medication, and just wanted to let women know that it is okay to reach out to mental health resources, and it's okay to use them as a way to overcome challenges.
I'm going to invite Andy to read this quote.
We're pretty good at finding friends that we can confide in and people that we can reach out to. But I wonder if we always have access to people who can really help us. We're not going to immediately go pour our hearts out to somebody we don't know, but perhaps by adding some of those contacts, it could expand our network.
And so with this question that we were discussing aloud about how could we as an organization help provide support when we think about that new leader or that newcomer to an area, because it was brought up again and again, that kind of divide, if you lived in rural and left and then came back, or were living in a different area, then you hadn't grown up there, that kind of disconnect between you and potentially some communities or some organizations to get involved in, that they weren't welcoming. They weren't really spaces for new individuals to join them. And so again, this kind of idea of mentorship and access to women who were doing the thing and were doing leadership and practicing it, and perhaps the ways that they could share their skills and what resources had helped them get into these spaces. They said, this individual had also mentioned that just, they have friends who understand, but they needed to know someone professionally who could help them with difficulties at work. When we talk about those barriers and navigating hierarchy, those communication needs, the ways to foster dialogue, it was a very, very prevalent idea. I'm going to invite Andy to read our next quote as well.
Even though we're working so hard to support women, once they enter a workplace that has no women in their setting and is not a supportive environment, I think about how hard that is. How can we set them up to succeed? And so I think about resiliency and having to teach conflict resolution or creating spaces for mentorship, even if it's outside an organization.
And this, again, as with all of these things as we're presenting, it showed up time and time again in these conversations. As we said earlier, we hosted 37 focus groups across the entire state. And these themes that just wove through conversations about having access to women who were doing the thing, who just could help provide guidance and support and say, I understand you and I know what you're going through. And not necessarily having that woman be inside of your organization, but just somebody that you could call when you're having a rough time, that you could connect with informally, was asked for time and time again. And so at the conclusion of our focus groups, we provided a space. I kind of called it an open mic of, is there something we didn't talk about today? Is there something that you would just like to comment on? And I thought that this quote was really salient of, it can feel pretty lonely when you're a woman leader. You may be the only one in the room, or you may be in a room with no one you know. And sometimes we like to eat our own. If there's another woman who's pushing back at you because she's navigated the good old boy network and whatnot, it can feel really lonely. And as you can probably see tied throughout these responses, it was an ask from our peers to support us, to recognize you're doing something that can be difficult, or perhaps your first time in this space. And we want to make sure you feel supported and given everything you needed, and that you see them as a leader and you want them to succeed as well. Kind of this almost if we think of leadership as a scarcity mindset, it's not something that's rare. There's enough leadership to go around. Other people can engage and can be strong too. At the end of our meetings, we also provided a feedback form, and we got really, really wonderful responses that people really enjoyed the flow, the format of our group. And I really think from this response of, I see 100 Rural Women as an opportunity to ponder how we catalyze empowerment to move out of survival and hyper alertness into thriving change agents. And I really couldn't have said that better myself, and thinking about all of the wonderful things that we had heard from individuals of how to move beyond the recognition of this is hard and this is difficult into action, and actually providing things and getting us moving forward beyond just the recognition of the barriers. I think overall there was, or excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. When we were talking about these wonderful, nuanced ideas and pieces that individuals were asking, we very specifically were coding in our transcripts requests. And I just want to show you a direct screenshot that we have had over 1,000 requests, that these are specific. I would like to see this. I would want to have this resource. And that's something that we're really excited to dig more into and figure out how we can help connect rural women to spaces that are already providing these things. As you can see, the far kind of column references is the individual time someone mentioned it. And so with this, you can see how prevalent community was, or professionally, I need something from my peer, ideas of how to navigate hierarchy and communication needs. And so you can just directly see where these kind of direct asks were being filed under. And before I hand it over to Teresa to go into our Q&A, I love this next quote, and I think it really highlights the difficulty of what we're trying to do of, I don't know if you can step into leadership easily, because you have to fall on your face quite a few times to learn from it, and then to use that experience to share with others. It is not usually an easy transition. Leadership usually comes with trials and errors and heartache. And that is something that we really want to recognize, that leadership professionally in a formal title or informally with our peers in a community group or even among friends can be really hard. And we really appreciate all of the women who shared their time and their experiences with us. I, on behalf of 100 Rural Women, before I get emotional, really want to thank everybody who came and spent time with us and shared their stories. We could not have done this without you. Thank you so much. Teresa, I will let you take it away.